As the war spread across the Algerian mountains and villages, the flames of rebellion grew hotter. French retaliation was brutal. Villages were burned, civilians tortured, entire communities punished in retribution. Welcome to Omar's story Nook, where history gets spicy, legends get a remix, and revolution walks softly with fire in her fists. Every tale you hear is a whisper of Omar, echoing through resistance songs, through bullet holes in walls, through the silence after an explosion in the heart of the Kasbah. For 132 years, France didn't just colonize Algeria, it swallowed it whole. Not a colony, a province of the French Republic. On paper, they called it part of the homeland. But on the ground, Muslims couldn't vote, couldn't speak Arabic in court, couldn't bury their dead with dignity without permission. Algerians became strangers in their own streets, prayers mocked, mothers humiliated, markets controlled, culture erased. But you cannot erase what bleeds. You cannot silence what remembers. And in 1954, the remembering turned to rage. The rage turned to rebellion. And the rebellion turned to war. This isn't just revolution. It's urban warfare in the Kasbah. It's women in heels carrying grenades. It's French paratroopers torturing truth underground. It's a people saying, we will not wait for freedom. We will take it. This is the Algerian War of Independence, and it did not come quietly. It came like fire. In 1830, French forces landed in Algeria not as visitors, but as conquerors. What began as a military operation quickly morphed into a brutal colonial occupation. Over the years, the French would strip the Algerian people of their rights, forcing them into the shadows of their own land. The French settlers didn't just take the land, they erased the culture. Arabic was banned from schools, mosques were transformed into military barracks, and the very soul of Algeria was suppressed beneath foreign boots. The Algerians endured, but by 1945, after the brutal Sétif massacre, the patience of the people had worn thin. Blood flowed on the streets, but with it came the spark of resistance. In 1954, the National Liberation Front (FLN) rose from the ashes of decades of oppression. They didn't ask for freedom. They took it, and with that, the empire began to crack. The war for Algeria's soul had begun. By 1956, the war had reached the heart of Algeria, Algiers, a city of stone and shadow. The Kasbah, the old quarter of the city, became the nerve center of resistance. Here, the FLN blended with everyday life, hidden in plain sight. In the crowded streets, under the hum of French military patrols, resistance brewed. Women, wearing veils as a symbol of protection, carried bombs disguised as everyday objects. They slipped them into French cafes and aboard trams. The French military, desperate to crush the resistance, responded with overwhelming force. Paratroopers were sent in, trained in terror tactics designed to break the spirit of the people. Torture became the norm as the French sought to intimidate the populace into submission. But the more brutal the response, the more determined the Algerian people became. The fight was no longer just for land. It was a fight for dignity, for the right to breathe freely, to live without the shackles of tyranny. And the flame of resistance refused to be extinguished. As the war spread across the Algerian mountains and villages, the flames of rebellion grew hotter. French retaliation was brutal. Villages were burned, civilians tortured, entire communities punished in retribution. The violence, once one-sided, now fueled a greater determination in the FLN. They adapted, becoming more skilled, more elusive. Strikes against French supply lines became more frequent, and the mountains of Algeria with their narrow passes and secret caves, became a sanctuary for the resistance. The once confident French Empire began to feel the pressure. Even in France itself, cracks began to appear. In 1961, parts of the French military, fearful of losing control, staged a coup to preserve colonial rule. But despite the brutality, despite the fear and oppression, the tide was shifting. By 1962, after a brutal cost of 1.5 million lives, France was forced to sign the Evian Accords, granting Algeria its hard-won independence. The empire was no longer invincible, and Algeria, scarred but unbroken, was free, and they rose. On July 5th, 1962, Algeria declared its independence. The streets of Algiers and other cities were filled with jubilation, people celebrating, dancing, singing. But amid the joy was a deep, unspoken grief. The cost of freedom had been steep. The revolution had torn families apart. Cities had been destroyed, and the land had been soaked in the blood of its children. The people of Algeria had fought not for a piece of paper or a promise of peace, but for something deeper, for a return to their land, their language, their dignity, for the right to define their future. The revolution was no longer just a political act, it was a rebirth, a new nation forged in the fire of resistance, but also in the pain of sacrifice. The scars would remain, but so would the strength, because in the end, freedom was earned, not in negotiations, but in bloodshed. It wasn't a gift, it was a birth, a reclaiming of a nation that refused to be forgotten. And that was the price of freedom. This isn't just history, this is Omar's story Nook, where truth whispers between the lines and legacy refuses to fade. Algeria didn't win its freedom with diplomacy. It carved it into stone, etched it in blood, and sewed it into the calloused palms of resistance. They didn't ask for liberation, they bled for it, burned for it, held it in clenched fists, and cradled it in lullabies sung by mothers who had lost everything, but not hope. The revolution didn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wore a veil. Sometimes it limped through markets. Sometimes it hid behind the soft hands of a woman walking into a French cafe with fire stitched into her handbag. France came with empire in its mouth. Algeria answered with silence, then smoke, then thunder. And when it was over, when the last soldier left and the flag of a new nation rose above rubble and graves, the world knew. You cannot colonize a people who remember who they are. You cannot break a soul that has already chosen freedom. You cannot silence a revolution that has learned how to speak with no sound at all. Because sometimes the fire doesn't destroy. Sometimes the fire is rebirth. The Algerian War, when a people burned to rise and a nation was forged in fire, until the next whisper of Omar. Stay listening.